This is Twisted Passages with award-winning author Marie Sutro. Now, let's take a deep dive into the dark world of psychological thrillers and meet the authors who created them.
Hello, and welcome to Twisted Passages. I'm your host, Marie Sutro, and today we have #1 internationally best-selling author, Rose Carlyle, here to talk about her new release, No One Will Know. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you, Marie. It's lovely to be on your show.
I am so excited you are here. This book really swept me away within the first few sentences. But before we get too far away, if you could just start our listeners off with a brief overview of what the story is about.
No One Will Know is about Eve, who is a very young woman who has grown up in foster care, and she thinks she's found the love of her life and everything is finally going well. And then the rug is pulled out from under her and she finds herself very much alone, friendless, penniless, and unexpectedly pregnant. At this point, things take a turn in her life when a wealthy and glamorous couple called Julia and Christopher Highgate offer her a job. And it's a dream job. It involves moving to a spectacular private island off the Australian coast. She's going to live in her own beautiful summer house next door to their amazing mansion. And everything seems too good to be true. And of course it is, because this is a thriller. But what I really love about this story and what I'm hugely excited about is that there is what I think is a killer twist that I don't think readers will guess. So they tend to think it's going in one direction and then everything changes.
I can attest to that. You had me hook, line, and sinker. I did not see the twist coming. I wanted to see it coming, but oh my God, you wove all of the little lines of fabric together so well. And actually, to start off, when we meet Eve, she's sailing, and that's something you have some experience with, right?
That's right. So I've done a lot of sailing in my life. I particularly love going out of sight of land and just being in the middle of the ocean with nothing around me except blue water and blue sky. Maybe, if you're lucky, some dolphins or whales or other sea life. And that's something that I wanted to weave into the novel, because I really like my stories to have a combination of the scary and terrible things that happen in a thriller, but also the magical and beautiful things. So it's really important to me to have beautiful, exotic settings so that the reader can feel swept away from their regular life into a kind of a dream world.
Well, you created the most beautiful dream world imaginable. And, you know, that setting, the island where she finds herself, it's, to me, very exotic. You know, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, so the state of California on the west coast of the US. And to me, the idea of an island off the coast of Tasmania was incredibly exotic and incredibly beautiful, the way that you wrote it. Have you visited any of those islands off of Tasmania before?
Yes, I mean, everyone in the world wants to visit Tasmania, right? Because it's a part of Australia, and yet it's also very different. It's a lot colder, it's quite remote, and the landscape is beautiful and unique. It's both austere and lovely. So I really enjoyed traveling to Tasmania, where I attended a writing conference and also did a whole lot of research for my book. And one of my favorite things was that I went to Bruny Island, which is a real life island that I've loosely based Breaksea Island on. And I visited the Bruny Island lighthouse, because I knew I wanted to have a lighthouse in the novel. There's such an atmospheric setting. They've got this eerie loneliness about them. And it was amazing to visit a real life one. And I felt truly inspired.
Well, as soon as folks read your book, they are going to want to go to Bruny Island, because the first thing, I mean, I was peeking, I have to admit. Normally I try to wait until the end of the book to go back, and if there's things I really like, to look up in real life and say, does this exist? And I was so heartbroken when I saw that your island was fictional. But now I'm so happy again to know that it's based on a real island that I might be able to go to and recapture elements of this great story.
Yeah, I had to make Breaks the Island fictional because on Bruny Island, the lighthouse is just on the island, whereas I wanted it to be on a separate little islet of its own for reasons that will become clear to readers when they read the book.
There was so much beyond just the amazing setting in this book, so much that you gave us to grapple with from Eve's perspective. One of those things, obviously, you mentioned she's pregnant, is motherhood. And you showed us some different approaches and different philosophies about motherhood. How important were those messages to show, the diverse styles of parenting?
I think that was something that came from deep in my heart. It's fascinating when you write a novel that you don't always know where it's coming from. So I actually started this book with the twist, because there's no way that you could start a book and then think of a twist like this, right? It has to be sort of embedded in the story from the start, kind of hiding in plain sight. And then I knew I wanted to name my protagonist Eve, because Eve is, biblically, she's the first mother. So she is a mother who has no role model. And my character also grows up in foster care, has no role model for mothering, and has to figure it all out from scratch. And that is why at the start of the book, she is quite naive and she makes some bad choices. But I also wanted to capture that her heart is in the right place. And so she grows throughout the book. She finds courage through that love for her child. Then I realized as I was writing that I was actually channeling my grandmother. So my grandmother, whose name was Eileen, also grew up in state care and became a mother without that role model. And yet she had 4 children under the age of 4, including twins. And her husband was a fisherman away at sea all week. And in those days, she had no fridge and no car. So she had to schlep to the shops every day with her children to buy fresh food. And you would think that someone who had no mother to learn from would have struggled. But she did not struggle. She loved it. She was such a great mother. And she, as a grandmother, inspired my own love of literature, which she handed down to us, even though as a foster child, she had been taken out of school at 13. So you would have thought that she would not have had a chance to have an education, but she educated herself through books, and she gave her grandchildren books. And she was our family's Eve. She was the origin of everything. So I was so delighted when I realized partway through writing that this is who I'm thinking of, and this is where the heart of my story comes from. And I was absolutely delighted to dedicate the book to my own mother and to my mother's mother, Eileen.
Well, you gave her such a beautiful tribute in this character, in the resilience and in that innate sense of undying love, of unconditional love that you put in there. That's a beautiful, beautiful tribute to your grandmother. And I can only imagine, wherever she is, how very proud she is of you.
I am so proud that I have been able to give her name to the world, and know that readers who are reading my book are learning her name. I feel it's quite rare for thrillers to have that emotional core to them. They're often much more plot-based rather than character-driven, and it just felt really special that I was able to bring that extra element to this story.
Well, I'm so glad you did, because in life, we're always looking for these, out of this world plots, right? These big, amazing plots with things that you just can't believe and make you say, oh, how many times in a row? And to hear about the real inspiration, how she was kind of an unsung hero, 4 children under the age of 4 and twins to boot. Oh my goodness. my younger sisters are twins, and I remember how difficult that was for my poor mom. You try to put one down, and then the other one's, up and loud, and then you try to get that one down. Now the other one's awake, and I just can't imagine. So hats off to her and all of those amazing unsung heroes, especially moms out there.
That's right. I mean, I really feel this book is dedicated to mothers everywhere, and they often are those unsung heroes. No one knows about the things that they did, and our lives are better for things that people did who, before we were born. Our grandmothers and our great grandmothers, they pass on the torch. And that's another reason why I have Eve. One of the things she does is she creates beautiful clothes for her child. And part of the reason for that is that I feel that that's almost a lost art, and it's often looked down upon in our society. The idea that you would sit at home knitting or sewing clothes for your child. I mean, obviously a lot of us are far too busy. We're working full time, but Eve does have the time. And I wanted to recognize that that is something that mothers have done for their children since time immemorial. We've clothed them and we've fed them. So all of this is going on at the same time as we have another quite different model of mothering in the story, in the form of Julia, who is, what's interesting about her is that she looks very similar to Eve. They almost look like twins. At one point, a character mistakes one for the other. And yet on the inside, they are very, very different women.
Very different women. And one of the things you touched on in terms of that difference a little bit was socioeconomic differences and kind of how that sometimes plays out in mothering styles, which I thought was very interesting. The haves and the have-not.
Precisely. So Julia is quite willing to sort of get someone else to do all the hard parts of mothering. And I mean, I am not judging women who, hand their child over because they have to go back to work or they choose to go back to work. But there is a point with Julia where it crosses from, a choice that she has made in the best interests of her family to something different. And then as the story goes on, we discover more and more about who Julia really is and what she's really up to. I really enjoyed that we go into her perspective. It took me a while to realize that that was what I needed to do, and that her story is actually really interesting as well. And Eve, of course, doesn't know everything about Julia's past. So when we finally get that later in the book, I think a whole lot of pieces fall into place.
And in the way that you did that, you slow played it so well, because it's almost this slippery slope of, oh, well, Julia's a different kind of mom, right? And we totally get, okay, well, this is her circumstances. So we're saying, all right, here's what we would assume. But the way that you crafted it, some of our assumptions may be faulty. And even Julia herself, what she may be showing us may or may not be true. So, really, really fascinating how you did that. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is you kicked off this story with Eve being a very isolated person. And she is alone. She's making these decisions. She doesn't really have any extended family. And she's suffering from trauma. And I thought about how there's always that age-old wisdom, right? Don't make any big decisions when you're suffering grief or trauma, because you might not like the decisions that you make out of that point in your life. Was that something you thought about intentionally, was to isolate her and to really put the screws to her in terms of where she is emotionally and what she's dealing with and what kind of decisions she's making because of that?
Absolutely, because I thought the decision that she makes early on in the novel is a bit of a hard sell, that anyone would make that decision. And I didn't want the readers to think, oh, well, she's just stupid. But I thought, well, what circumstances might you be in where you're desperate enough and also not thinking straight? She's definitely not thinking straight after, the event that happens. I know it's the end of chapter 1, but I still don't really want to spoil it because it does kind of come out of the blue. And that's something I love about this book, that every time the reader thinks we're having one thing happen, they get sideswiped and something else happens. But certainly there's a lot in the in the beginning of the book that explains why Eve makes a decision that we might be screaming it as readers to do something else.
It was entirely plausible, entirely understandable, and it made Eve someone that I felt for even so much more than I would have, as you said, if it had just been, somebody on the street being confronted with this decision. You'd think, oh, why would you make that decision? But here it's like you just want to put your arms around her and say, oh, poor Eve, my goodness, you just want to console her and be there for her and help her. Going back to setting real quick, just for one moment, out of that setting, we meet some characters who don't ever give us their point of view. We don't get to actually hear from them, and they're pink. Could you tell us about those characters, those little characters that skitter a little bit along the rocks on the island?
Oh, sure. So Eve really enjoys seeing wildlife after her sailing journey. She swam with a whale in the Pacific Ocean, and she starts to notice that there are some really beautiful tiny little geckos on the island, which are pink and green harlequin. That's the pattern on their skins. And of course, they're quite distinctive, and she starts to wonder, where have they come from? Are they native to Tasmania? And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that she begins to suspect that they are being internationally smuggled. And so this is a crime that it's an area of organized crime that is occurring worldwide. There's a lot of money in it, and yet it just doesn't seem to be written about in fiction. And it came to my attention a few years ago when I discovered that, New Zealand is a very remote island or set of islands in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, and we have unique flora and fauna here. The kiwi is, our most famous bird, but we also have these beautiful skinks and geckos, even their names, the jeweled gecko, the elegant gecko, the harlequin gecko. And a man was arrested trying to board a flight with, I kid you not, 44 live geckos and skinks sewn into his underwear when he tried to get on the plane. And that got me thinking, how much money is involved for someone to do that? That's really desperate. So I started researching. There's very little online about it. It's very little known. But this just slotted so well into Eve's story because she is living on a remote island in Tasmania. The nearest land is New Zealand, which is a good week's sail away. People don't realize how far away New Zealand and Australia are from each other. And if you didn't want to get on a plane to take geckos out of New Zealand, then the only other way really would be a yacht, which I have to say would mean you would not have to put them in your underpants.
That idea of having first of all, one gecko or one skink just on their own in your underpants. I'm assuming these were big underpants to fit that many. And I don't know if they were drugged, or I'm hoping they were drugged, but maybe they weren't. And that's why the authorities figured it out. I don't know. I
just can't imagine. But it was such a fascinating area to write about in a novel. And because, there's so many books written about murder and drugs, whereas this is quite a unique crime. And I felt that it brought something quite unique to the story, as well as the other kind of crime, which is illegal adoption, that's also being explored in this story.
Yeah, it seems like when it comes to money, there's always someone out there who is willing to break every social norm, every moral rule that we think we live by to make that money. And unfortunately, the more morals and norms and rules have to be broken, the more the price goes up, right?
That's right. And I think there's a lot of attention at the moment on rich people and how they behave badly and spend money to get their way. And that's another thing that I really enjoyed exploring in this novel, because Julia and Christopher are wealthy. You wouldn't think that they would need more money, but they really abuse their wealth and power. And I think that's something that readers are particularly interested in at the moment.
Well, all of those issues, socioeconomic clashes, power imbalances, just incredible atmosphere, so many twists and turns. You want to talk about a roller coaster. You had me going so many times where I thought, oh my gosh, the track is disappearing. Where could we possibly be going? And then we're just running at such a crazy pace. I loved it. And one of the best parts about it, for as much as I adored every page I turned, the ending was so satisfying. You gave us so much. You really wrapped up every loose string.
Well, I still find it unbelievable how late in the piece I wrote that ending. So I had already sold the book and I was working with my editor, and I just felt the ending didn't quite carry off. So my debut, The Girl in the Mirror, has an actual final sentence twist. And my editor said to me, can't you do that this time? And I just thought, I can't possibly. It's too late. I've written the book. And then one day I was out swimming in the ocean. I'd been editing all day, and I kept thinking about a character who we had not heard from directly and what would happen if we went into her head. And suddenly the ending came to me. And the funny thing is that it fits in so well with the title of the book that if we hadn't already had that title, we would have had to change it to No One Will Know. So I was just delighted to have, again, what I felt like was that sort of mic drop moment, because that's what people said about The Girl in the Mirror. So I was really excited to be able to supply that with No One Will Know. So I rushed home and wrote the epilogue in one sitting, and I knew that I finally got the ending that the book should have always had.
Well, it was absolutely perfect, because I'm one of those little geeky people who from the start stares at the front cover and thinks about, what does the title mean? What could it possibly mean? And I'm always thinking and reevaluating every time I take a break, right? If it's, I'm actually going to go to bed for the night, or if I'm going to go have lunch or whatever it is, I'm always thinking, hey, how much I've read, how does that tie into this title? And like you said, that was one of the most satisfying final words of a sentence in a book that I ever read. It was so well done.
Oh, thank you. I do love a great final sentence. I love the reader to feel satisfied and that everything's tied up at the end. I don't want to be open-ended. I want it to be a chef's kiss, and that's the end of the book.
Well, for your existing readers who already love you, and for your future readers who will fall in love with you once they read this book, where is the best place to find you, Rose?
I'm on Instagram at Rose Carlyle 100, although I'm sure you can just type my name in, and Facebook, R Carlyle author. But again, I'm sure if you just type my name in, I'll come up. I'm also on Twitter. So I'm on all three social media, and you can follow me on Amazon and Goodreads as well.
Wonderful. Well, we've got to make sure that everyone knows about No One Will Know, because it is absolutely a phenomenal read. Thank you so much for writing this great story, Rose, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Marie. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you all for listening in on this episode of Twisted Passages. We hope to see you next time.